Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is top tips for taking animal portraits, and it will be presented by our fabulous expedition leader, Aditya Panda. Aditya, thank you once again for being here today and sharing your amazing photos with us. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Sunny. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here again and be presenting on another wildlife photography topic. Before we start, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Aditya Panda, and I have been leading NatHab's India expeditions since 2016. Before I start my presentation, and so that you can enjoy the pictures in full screen, I'll turn my webcam off and I'll turn it right back on once we get to the Q&A. So, animal portraiture. Well, a portrait, by definition, should show an individual up close and personal, and in a lot of detail, be it in a painting or a photograph. And animal portraiture, while probably being the most ubiquitous form of wildlife photography, is also, I think, the purest form of wildlife photography. And you see, a lot of us go on safari, a lot of us go on other wildlife trips. Some of us might do a lot of wildlife photography, even on an everyday basis in our gardens and in parks around our neighborhoods. And all of us aspire, of course, to get good quality pictures. Now, most of us, I'm sure, and I'm happy to admit to it, most of us try to get close-ups of portraits of the animals we photograph. Of course, it's more creative to get them, in action shots or get animals, in their landscape doing something interesting. And of course, we all want to do creative stuff like getting silhouettes of animals and things like that. But I think portrait photography is the comfort food of wildlife photography. All of us ultimately want nice, interactive close-ups of the animals we want to photograph. A lot of us who might not be very experienced with photography or our camera gear can sometimes end up being rather disappointed with the results of our photos, once we get back home from a nice wildlife sighting. Something that looks brilliant to the eye, looks amazing with the binoculars, and appears to look all fine through the viewfinder. And once we go back home and download our pictures onto a computer, not look as flattering as we had thought they might. And often when we compare our pictures with the pictures of the pros, we find a lot of things lacking in our photos. And in today's topic, I'm going to talk about how we can make our animal portraits stand out, regardless of the kind of equipment we use. Of course, in the things that I'm going to talk about, equipment does play a big role, but there are several other things that one can do to try and get amazing pictures without necessarily having to, break the bank and buy the most expensive gear. I have narrowed down three factors that, by and large, 90% of the time, make any animal picture, especially portraits, stand out. And these three fundamental factors. You can call them three basic rules, but you know, rules are meant to be broken. And I'd like to give a disclaimer that these rules apply in, in most circumstances, not in all. There are always circumstances when you can break the rules and still end up with something interesting, something beautiful, something different. But by and large, these three basic foundational sort of factors will make most animal pictures look good and stand out. And these are that the subject should be sharp and in focus. The background should be clean so that the animal stands out from the background. Of course, this applies to portrait photography. And it goes without saying that in portrait photography, close-ups are usually nicest. And therefore, I haven't included that among the three rules. But yes, it is important most of the time to have a clean background so that the animal stands out of the frame and you can see it in detail without distractions anywhere else on the frame. And it always helps to have a high degree of technical quality and detail in your pictures, good contrast, bright saturated colors, and a picture that is free of what we call noise or what was called grain in the old film days. So let's start with sharpness. The most important factor in getting a sharp picture, I think, is shutter speed. The shutter speed, of course, is the amount of time that the camera, the camera's mirror or shutter in front of the sensor goes up and comes down. So it's basically the length of time for which the sensor of our camera is exposed to light. And the longer the shutter speed, that is, the slower the shutter speed, the more amount of light that the sensor can gather. But at the same time, the longer your shutter speed, the longer your exposure, or the slower your shutter speed, the more the chances are that any movement of your subject is also going to be captured on your sensor, therefore causing a blurred image. In wildlife photography, most of the time, we try to have as high a shutter speed as possible. So, a fast shutter speed is going to freeze action, and it's going to give us a sharp picture. And our subjects, being wild animals, are rarely still. They're mostly moving about. And to get a sharp picture, a sharp portrait of the close-up of the head or face or the whole of an animal, it always helps to have a high shutter speed because the animal will continue to move about, blink its eyes, and as some of you might remember from some of my past webinars on photography, as long as the eye of the animal is in sharp focus, the rest of the animal is in focus enough. That's a rule I follow by and large. So having a high shutter speed helps us get a sharp picture. A lot of people think that a shutter speed of about 1/250th of a second is fast enough. Just a few years ago, before camera technology has been evolving incredibly fast, and just a few years ago, one could not shoot higher than, say, ISO 400 in most cases to be able to get usable quality pictures. And in those periods, a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second was considered sort of fairly standard to try and get sharp pictures of animals. But your keeper rate is going to go down really badly if you use a shutter speed of that speed with most animal pictures. I think personally that even with relatively slow moving animals, say even stationary animals like an elephant standing and feeding, or a big cat sitting down and looking at you, or even a large bird that is perched and not really moving about. Even in those cases, I would personally prefer if I could have a shutter speed of at least 1/1000th per second. That will incredibly improve my keeper rate, and it's a very comfortable shutter speed for a stationary animal. For birds in flight, like this duck, northern pintail duck taking off here, I would prefer shutter speeds upwards of, say, closer to 1/4000th of a second. And as soon as you start improving your shutter speed in your wildlife photography, as soon as you start using higher shutter speeds, you will notice an instant difference in the kind of results that you get, an instant difference in the number of keepers that you get from every shoot. Another very important factor for getting good sharpness is good support. Now, most of us shoot our wildlife pictures with longer lenses, with long telephoto lenses, because our animals, our subjects are usually far away. And this applies even to smaller cameras, which have to zoom. Even, the so-called bridge cameras, or prosumer cameras, which might not have a humongous long telephoto lens attached to it, but might have a nice telephoto capability of, say, 120 times or so, is also something that requires good support. So when you shoot with a long lens, handheld, there is invariably going to be some amount of shake that will sort of seep in, and it's going to affect your keeper rate. It's going to affect the number of pictures that turn out sharp from every 10 or 20 or 100 pictures that you shoot. And even at high shutter speeds, the sheer bulk of the gear can cause you to have some amount of shake, and that is going to seep into your results. So, under ideal conditions, a camera with a long lens should be mounted on a tripod, and that's not always practically possible, especially with wildlife, because you have to be moving around most of the time, either hiking or crawling on the ground, or as is the case most of the times in India and Africa, you will be confined to a safari vehicle, in which it's pointless to put a tripod. So unless you have the luxury of a situation where you're sitting in a hide, or sitting somewhere from where you can remain stationary and observe a lot of wildlife, having the tripod is usually not the best idea. So in those cases, I would suggest that try your best to use either a beanbag or a monopod, both of which are extremely suitable to a mobile person, a mobile photographer moving around, walking, driving, or in safari vehicles especially, beanbags are the best. So the most sharp pictures come from the most stable cameras. So try and keep your camera as stable as possible. If you do not have access to a beanbag or a monopod and you're out in the field shooting, try taking support of whatever natural elements are around. If you're photographing shorebirds, for example, you can lie down on the ground, hold your lens in your arms, support it, support your elbows on the ground, or even rest the lens on the ground or on a rock or against a tree, or just improvise with whatever best local um, conditions offer. Um, an empty camera bag makes a really nice bean bag. It makes a really nice support for long lenses. So that's something you could use. We all use different brands of cameras. We have various different brands, and they all have different uh, autofocus area modes. Um, you know, the cameras have autofocus points that are spread across the viewfinder that you can see, while you're shooting. And in different modes, they cover different uh, portions or different area of the viewfinder. And the best autofocus area mode uh, for me, ideally, is a single point that I can move around. So a single point autofocus area mode is the best option for me. Now, different camera brands have different terms and different names for all these various different modes, which is why I'm not going to go into them, but I will try to be more literal in while explaining the different autofocus area modes. So a single point autofocus area mode is it just uses the smallest autofocus area that you can reliably keep on your subject. And in the case of a stationary subject or a subject that isn't moving really fast, I prefer to keep a single point autofocus autofocus point on the eye of the animal, and that really helps me keep it constantly in sharp focus as I shoot. And it is really useful when an animal is behind foliage, it's behind cover, behind brush, and it's difficult to keep track of it through your viewfinder. And if you have a single point autofocus point um, sort of nailed on the eye of the animal, it does a brilliant job of getting it in focus. Of course, as an animal starts to move, then you can use a multi-point autofocus point, because a single point might be difficult to keep up with the moving animal, and these multi-point modes make it far easier to keep track, to keep focus on a moving animal. But multi-point modes will have their disadvantages. Look, for example, at this tiger's face. If I place a multi-point autofocus point on its face, it seems to want to focus anywhere but exactly where I wanted to focus. I wanted to focus on the eye of the tiger, but the multi-point, the multiple autofocus point might choose to focus on the nose or the forehead or the cheek or on a leaf that's coming in the way. So that will not give me a tack sharp eye. Therefore, I prefer to use a single point autofocus mode while I'm doing that. But of course, in the case of birds in flight or animals moving out in the open in a herd, or even an individual animal in a relatively obstruction-free environment moving across a plain or that sort of situation, feel free to use the multi autofocus point to help keep track of the animal. Now, in all situations, in fact, with wildlife, and especially in situations where circumstances are forcing you to use slightly lower shutter speeds, it always helps to shoot longer bursts of pictures. If you know, say there's an animal sitting, and the best shutter speed you can manage for that situation in say fairly low light conditions is say 1/60th of a second or 1/100th of a second. And your chances of getting a sharp picture under those circumstances become probably less than 50%, maybe 25%, maybe 10%, we don't know. So in those cases, it helps to shoot a long burst of pictures so that you get, 10 or 20 or 50 pictures of that animal. And that significantly improves your chances of getting one or two pictures that happen to be absolutely tack sharp. So in situations where uh, lighting conditions mandate slower shutter speeds, just use a long burst, a longer sequence of burst images. And as a matter of habit and as a matter of practice, even with higher shutter speeds, it always helps with wildlife to get a long burst of pictures so that you can get, maybe the wink of an animal's eye, or a glimpse of catchlight, or there are so many different expressions and behaviors that you can capture using the burst mode that you might miss if you shoot single shots. One thing that hampers sharpness in pictures when everything else seems to be fine and no mistake has been made on part of the photographer is heat distortion. Now, this happens when the temperature, the air temperature between where the camera is and where the subject is happens to be different, and that causes sort of hot air and cold air to mix, and air of different densities to sort of um, uh, clutter the scene, and that causes refraction problems with light, which causes you to get pictures that aren't sharp. And say this picture, for example, is a really old picture that I took with the 6-megapixel DSLR when I was starting my wildlife photography career. And this picture was taken in the afternoon of a saltwater crocodile feeding on the carcass of a cow. Just on a side note, just look at the size of that crocodile. Just compare that head with the size of the cow. Now, saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptilians on Earth, and they can grow to well over 20 feet, sometimes 22, 23 feet is what the world records are. And this individual was close to 20 feet. But let's not digress. In this picture, you see, especially in this area here, and also here in the background, this area, you see there's a lot of ugly distortion, and that is caused by heat distortion. This picture of an Egyptian vulture that I took, while it's turned out fairly okay, if you look at the background, there is some amount of heat distortion in this image as well, which works fine because in this case it works fine because I photographed the vulture in a sort of dry and hot environment, and the heat distortion sort of adds to the feel of the place. It gives a sense of place. But this is just another example of heat distortion. Actually, while I was looking for examples of heat distortion pictures to put in today's presentation, I couldn't find many because I am in this habit of deleting any pictures that are less than perfect to save on just hard drive space. So these were the two best I could manage to give you examples. If you Google up heat distortion and do an image search, you'll find a lot of example photos. Now, the way to deal with heat distortion is to try and get closer to your subject in order to minimize the temperature difference between your, where your camera is and where your subject is. Of course, you have to get closer to your subject without compromising your own safety or disrupting the animal's behavior. Heat distortion can also happen in situations where, say, you're traveling in a car and you're shooting out of a car, and you have the air conditioner running, and it's cold inside the car and hot outside, or it's cold outside and it's you've turned the heater on and it's hot inside the car. And if you lower your glass and put your camera outside your window and start shooting at an animal, the area just outside your window, right in front of your camera, is going to be one where hot air and cold air mix, and that is going to cause heat distortion and mess up your pictures, besides also very likely fogging up your lens. So it helps to turn off the air conditioner, roll down the glasses, and just make sure that the ambient temperature inside the car is the same as the temperature outside. Of course, regardless of whether you're using you're shooting handheld or off a beanbag or even on a tripod, and I'll explain why you need this even on a tripod. But most of our lenses today and most of our modern mirrorless cameras have some sort of shake reduction technology. Lenses usually have things like vibration reduction or VR in Nikon, image stabilization or IS in Canon, there's optical stabilization in Sony, I believe, and there is what is called IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, that most mirrorless cameras have these days. And it helps to turn these on, and you can these work fantastically well. They can compensate up to 5 stops, sometimes more, of shutter speed for handheld pictures, and help reduce a lot of shake. Now, why I said that you should use your VR despite every rule book asking you not to use it when you mount your camera on a tripod, is because on a tripod, in the case of wildlife photography, you're not shooting in the same style as you would, or as a studio photographer would, indoors. A studio photographer would have full control over his or her subject and will lock the camera into position on the tripod, ensuring that it is absolutely still. So there, it is okay to turn the VR off and not allow it to interfere with the tripod, and you get pictures that are absolutely sharp. But with wildlife, even at higher shutter speeds, even with a tripod, you almost never lock your camera into position, as you shouldn't, because your subject is moving, and even that little amount of movement is compensated well by modern image stabilization systems in cameras. And most cameras and lenses these days recognize when they're mounted on a tripod and work accordingly. So feel free to use these modes while even using a tripod. Now, cameras these days offer you the option of fine-tuning the autofocus on your particular lens, on your individual lens. Now, a lot of people end up doing this unnecessarily and messing up a perfectly good lens. And most lenses do not need autofocus fine-tuning. A lens that requires autofocus fine-tuning is a lens that consistently focuses or front focuses, um, on a regular and consistent basis. Now, what I mean by back focusing and front focusing is that when you place the autofocus point at a certain spot, the lens tends to focus. A lens that requires autofocus fine-tuning or calibration will tend to focus either a little ahead of that point or a little behind it. Now, when a lens starts to do that, and one thing to keep in mind is when a lens starts to do that on a consistent basis, then it requires autofocus fine-tuning. And it requires autofocus fine-tuning if it back focuses consistently or front focuses consistently. If your lens is back focusing and front focusing in different pictures, then it is not a lens problem, it is a photographer problem. So don't unnecessarily try and mess around with fine-tuning, with autofocus fine-tuning in camera. Do it after taking a series of test shots, ideally mounted on a tripod and aimed at a stationary subject in very controlled environments, so that you can be sure that your lens either has or doesn't have a calibration problem. And it's best to take it to the shop, to the service center, to have them do the autofocus fine-tuning rather than doing it at home. Now, that was what I had to say about sharpness. Our next topic is the bokeh or bokeh, depending on how you pronounce it. I pronounce it, I mostly call it bokeh. Bokeh is the out of focus, blurred background in a picture. And with wildlife portraiture, as with human portraiture, people portraiture, or with pet portraiture, it really is pleasing to have a very clean and pleasant, absolutely buttery smooth bokeh, and have the subject in sharp focus, but a beautiful clean background that does not interfere with the subject, that adds to the mood of the picture, but it helps make the subject stand out. So how do we get a good bokeh? Let's see how we can do that. Number one is to have fast glass, fast lenses. Now, don't run away. I'm not going to tell you that buying super expensive, really fast lenses are the only way to get a good bokeh. There are several other ways that I'll talk about later, but the fact of the matter is that having a lens that has a wide aperture, a very wide aperture, is really helpful in getting great shallow depth of field and great bokehs. So another thing that really affects the quality of your bokeh is distance. Distance between you and your subject, and the distance between the subject and its background. The rule here, the rule of thumb here, is that the farther away the background is from the subject, the better the bokeh is going to be, and the closer the subject is to you or your camera, the better the bokeh is going to be. So that is something that really helps, and you can improve the quality of your bokeh by keeping this rule in mind, regardless of what camera you use. Focal length plays a big role in getting a nice bokeh as well. The longer your lens, the longer your telephoto lens, the better your bokeh is naturally going to be. So that is another important point. If you want a nice bokeh, zoom in as close as you can, or if you're using nice, expensive fast prime telephoto lenses, use the longest possible lens that you can. That is going to give you a nice, creamy, beautiful bokeh. Another way to try and get beautiful bouquets is to try and get as low as possible. That way, remember what I said about the background and your subject and the distance between them and the relation of that with the quality of your bokeh. So if you get low as you can, literally to ground level, it really causes the perception that the background, be it the sky, be it the terrain, it sort of from that perspective, you get the maximum possible distance between your subject and its background. And that really helps in getting some nice bouquets when in this exact same situation, if you got up, if you shot down at the animal, it would not give you any bokeh because you would be shooting the immediate background of the animal. The ground behind the animal, would be right behind it, and it will simply not give you the kind of blurred foreground and background that getting low can give you. Another bokeh tip that works, but one again where I do not mean to suggest that you should go out and buy the latest full frame expensive camera, is that you do end up getting better bokehs with a full frame camera than you would on a crop sensor camera. Now, with a full frame camera at the same focal length, you can get much closer to your subject than you can with a crop sensor camera, because the crop sensor camera essentially gives you the field of view. Say, if we compare a full frame camera with the Nikon D500, which is what I shoot, the D500 has a 1.5 time crop. It is an APS-C camera, which means its sensor is 1.5 times smaller than the sensor of a full frame camera. So when I mount a 500mm lens on my Nikon D500, it essentially gives me the field of view of a 750mm lens, while on a full frame camera it would be a true 500mm perspective. So what essentially happens is that from a much farther distance, I end up filling my frame with the animal and having to shoot necessarily farther away than in the exact same situation if I would be shooting with a full frame camera. Now, once you get closer, remember the rule again, the closer you are to your subject, the better your bokeh is. So with a full frame camera, it is far easier to get a better bokeh with the exact same lens in the exact same situation than it would be with a crop sensor camera. Another rule that helps to keep in mind with getting good bokehs is do not crop. If you think that the rule about long telephoto lenses helping with bokehs applies to cropping, then that isn't correct. If you crop, you do not end up getting a better bokeh. In fact, you when you shoot from a distance with a shorter telephoto lens, you will just end up getting a bokeh that is only going to be sort of enhanced and exaggerated when you crop that picture, and it is not going to be a pleasant bokeh. So it helps to not crop and to try instead to get closer to the subject and fill the animal in the frame. That way you get a far better bokeh than you would if you shot an animal from a distance with a shorter telephoto lens and then later chose to crop it and crop it close. You will not get a great bokeh that way. Our next topic, the third most important factor in getting great animal portraits is detail and quality, and by that I mean technical detail of the image and quality thereof. Of course, this depends tremendously on the camera that you're shooting with and its own capabilities and its own technical perfection. But there are certain things we can do to try and maximize those factors, regardless of what camera we are shooting with. So, to try and get high technical quality, we of course will want sharp pictures, but we will want our pictures to be full of contrast and have a lot of detail, a lot of dynamic range in them, and as little noise as possible. And we will want the colors to be saturated and to pop out, but not, as I will mention, overdo anything. The first way to ensure this is to shoot in a RAW format if your camera gives you that option. And most cameras, even phones these days, provide the option of shooting in the RAW format. Shooting in the RAW format allows you to capture as much detail as is technically possible in your image file, and that gives you tremendous room to again fine-tune that picture and get the most out of it in post-processing on your computer back home. Shooting in JPEG format is easier. It's easier to transfer the pictures. You can shoot a lot more pictures. It is easier to share the pictures, but in JPEG, in the JPEG format, you end up losing a lot of detail and a lot of quality that you would preserve if you shot in the RAW format. I shot this tigress in central India, walking in beautiful golden light of the morning with a spotted deer fawn that she had just killed and was carrying for her cubs. The lighting situation was a little tricky because while it was beautiful golden morning light, winter morning light, the light was opposite, and I needed to capture the details in the shadow areas, which is here, to be able to get a good picture with proper detail that I could work on. And because I had shot in the RAW format, I could recover all those details in post-processing and ended up getting this this fine picture. Noise is the enemy of detail, and noise increases, as you know, when in several situations. So one of the key factors affecting noise is the ISO, or the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. And we all know that at lower ISOs there is lesser noise, and at higher ISOs the noise increases correspondingly. It's digital noise. It makes our pictures look really ugly, and we put in every effort we can to try and get rid of that noise. And of course, these days you have some great softwares that do a superb job of removing noise, but it always helps to start out with a really high quality file and get things right from the start, straight from the camera, so that we have the best possible quality of file to work with. And one of the best ways to ensure minimal noise while shooting wildlife pictures is to shoot wide open. So if you shoot with a wide open aperture, you get a very shallow depth of field and beautiful bokeh, which was the second aim of our picture of our portrait photography. And at the same time, if you shoot wide open, you can get fast enough shutter speeds at lower ISOs. That will help you get lower noise. Of course, all these factors, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO depend on the light conditions where you're shooting. So depending on those, you might have to change them, and they might not always be ideal, but it helps to try and keep the ISO as low as possible, the shutter speed as high as possible, and the aperture as wide as possible. One thing I do often is to start out by shooting at a higher ISO, and once I've got enough safety shots, as I call them, I begin to progressively decrease my ISO and attempt to sneak as many low ISO sharp pictures as I can. That is a technique I call ISO insurance, because remember, if you remember from my past webinars, the most important rule in wildlife photography is get the shot. That is the most important rule. You can play around with technique and the art side of things later, but the most important thing is to get the shot. Another technique that works really well with digital photography is something called expose to the right. Now, it's always useful to learn to read your histogram, and your histogram basically tells you, where in the spectrum between black and white and all shades of gray, where most of the data that you have, most of the pixels that you have captured in your image lie. And what your camera will try to do most of the time is to get this, a neutral average exposure. So in wildlife photography and also in landscape photography, it helps to try and overexpose your pictures by a little bit, just a little bit, maybe a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop, not more than that. Don't overexpose so much that you end up losing your highlights. Just overexpose enough to have most of the data, most of the pixels on your histogram towards the right hand side. Yeah, right? Not clipped and lost in an overexposed fashion like here, but something like this, a little right of neutral. Because if you underexpose your pictures a little bit, or even if you have a neutral exposure and a lot of portions of the picture are dark or in shade or in shadows, then if you try to recover those in post-processing, then you will end up getting a tremendous amount of ugly noise. However, if you overexpose slightly without losing your highlights, without clipping your highlights, and you pull back the highlights in post, you will get fantastic detail out of your pictures while preserving your shadows and not having any noise. So as a rule, try and practice this technique of exposing to the right. Biggest rule of all is that nothing is mandatory. There are no rules, only guidelines. And you can get beautiful animal portraits by breaking all of the rules, by thinking out of the box and being, just being creative and enjoying your photography. The most important thing is that you get the shot and that your shot gives a sense of place where you're shooting this, and what not just what you see while you're photographing, but what you feel while you're photographing. So with that, I would like to open the house for questions.
Wow, that was amazing. Those images you captured are just stunning. And we've got lots of questions already, but I want to remind everyone that they can submit questions via the questions field in the control panel. So let me try to sift through some of these. let's see here. Do you have any experience with Sony full frame cameras using the clear image zoom? Do you know if it distorts the picture? Sorry, that's a very technical one to start with.
Unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to, you know, test out Sony full frame cameras yet, the latest Sony mirrorless ones. But I'd love to look that up and get back with a response. So, Sunny, if you can note down the email ID of the person who's put this question up, I'd love to get back on that.
Sounds good. I will do that. Is there any situation where a crop camera is recommended over full frame? If not, what are their advantages? Just price?
Well, there are many advantages. There are several advantages. Of course, price is a big one. But in wildlife photography, crop sensor cameras can be of a great advantage because they instantly add to magnification in that the field of view is narrower and you can get closer to your subject with the same kind of lens. Crop sensor cameras also usually offer better frame rates when used in the burst mode. They're lighter than their full frame counterparts, so easier to handhold, and they're just excellent usually for birds and wildlife.
Okay. Do you usually shoot in manual mode or in shutter speed mode?
Neither, actually. I primarily shoot in aperture priority, which is what works best for me. Sometimes in certain situations, I do switch to manual mode, but rarely, if ever, I have shot in the shutter priority mode. But these are things that work differently for individuals. So I know a lot of photographers who shoot in shutter priority and they put ISO in auto mode, and they have full control over the shutter speed of the camera, and they get brilliant results. Aperture priority is what works for me. Manual works for some, shutter priority works for some. So if it works for you, just continue doing it.
Sounds good. Can you explain how adding a teleconverter affects the f-stop?
Well, it will reduce your aperture. So if you use a 1.4 times teleconverter, it reduces your f-stop by 1 stop. So say your lens has a maximum aperture of f4, and you attach a 1.4 times teleconverter, you will essentially get, while you'll get a longer focal length, you will get an aperture of only f5.6. And similarly, with a 2 times teleconverter, the aperture is going to be reduced by 2 stops. So an f4 becomes an f8.
Okay. When you were talking about noise, you mentioned to keep the ISO low, the shutter speed high, but what do you do with the aperture setting? Can you clarify that?
Keep it as wide as possible. The wider your aperture, the higher your shutter speed can be. So a high shutter speed, your shutter speed has no relation with noise, but a high shutter speed is essential to get sharp pictures. And the amount of light entering your lens by the aperture. So if you shoot at a low ISO, then you need to allow as much light in as possible. Now there are 2 ways of doing that, either by using a wide aperture or by using a slower shutter speed. Now you don't want to do a slower shutter speed because that's going to give you shake. So you use as wide an aperture as possible. So the highest possible aperture that your lens or your camera allows.
Got it. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Any thoughts on mirrorless cameras versus DSLR?
Well, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that mirrorless cameras are here to stay. The DSLR is going the way of the dinosaur, um, and it's just a matter of time that the mirrorless becomes. It's already become mainstream. Most camera companies have stopped manufacturing DSLRs now. DSLRs are still good for another few years. The latest top-end DSLRs as still cameras are going to be excellent still for another 4 or 5 years maybe. But the future is mirrorless and there is no escaping that.
Got it. Well, thank you again. That was fabulous information. I don't know how much of it I totally understood. It's so technical and so complicated, but you create such amazing images. So hopefully I picked up a few things, and I know our guests really appreciated it. Lots of comments here thanking you for this presentation. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for any last comments.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any particular topics that you'd like me to present on, more technically on wildlife photography, on equipment, on post-processing, do put that in the suggestions or comments, and maybe we'll do public demand topics in the future. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and I'll see you not very soon, but in about a little more than a month with my next webinar. So have a great time. Enjoy Daily Dose of Nature.
Sounds good. Enjoy your month off. Are you going to be in the field?
A little bit in the field, but the first week of October we have, the autumn festive season. So it's going to be time with family and, just generally vacationing.
Sounds good. We'll enjoy it. We'll look forward to seeing you again in a month or so. Thanks everybody who tuned in today, and thanks as always for submitting such awesome questions. Please join us again for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.